All right, Billy McDonald, wingman to Chennault. It all started for McDonald with the 3 men on the flying trapeze at Maxwell Field in Montgomery in December of 1933. The team performed 50 shows and were seen by over 1 million people in 3 years.
Chennault was a throwback to the dashing pilots of the First World War. During the 1930s, he had been the leader of a popular flying team in the United States Army Air Corps, who called themselves the 3 Men on the Flying Trapeze. The daredevil stunts of the flying trapeze were proof to Chennault that fighter planes could engage in combat in close formation through the most violent of maneuvers. But the high command of the Army Air Corps believed that a new generation of bombers had made fighter planes obsolete, a novelty to amuse the public, but useless in modern warfare. After years of ridicule at the hands of his superiors,
Chennault would continue to fight for pursuit planes through 1936. The next strip of film was seen in movie theaters throughout the United States, and in the first strip, McDonald is on the left-hand side, and next to him is Lieutenant, the lieutenant he replaced on the team that Chennault brought him in specifically to replace, and then Chennault and Williamson.
The crack flying team of the Air Corps Tactical School here. And can they fly? Just watch them. They're past masters of daring, and watch them do their famous formation roll. With the greatest of ease. Stunts, turns, spins, and rolls and loops in close formation like soldiers on a drill field. It's an amazing display of skill and daredevil nerve.
This is a picture of McDonald, Chennault, and Williamson as winners of the 1935 Miami Air Races. They were seen at that air race, which they won their division in, the acrobatic division, by a Chinese delegation of officers who offered them lucrative contracts to come to China and train Chinese fighter pilots. McDonald was making $58 a month as a sergeant in the Army Air Corps, an enlisted flying man, and they offered him $600 a month to go to China, so he thought it was a pretty good idea. And Chennault turned it down for all 3, but asked the Chinese to keep the offer open until they got the results back from the second lieutenant's exam, which had been given at Maxwell Field. There were 8 enlisted flying men who took the test. And you guessed it, of the 8 that took the test, the only 2 that failed were McDonald and Williamson. Chennault was incensed, to say the least, and wrote a scathing op-ed in the Montgomery Advertiser, and came back and told McDonald and Williamson that they should accept the Chinese offer, and if things didn't go well for him, and he didn't expect them to, he would be about a year behind them. They bought out their enlistments for $89.60 and went to the Chinese embassy in Washington and bought out and were given $500 apiece in expense money. They went to Vancouver, Canada, hooked up with C.B. Smith out of Montgomery, who was Chennault's mechanical genius, and Ralph Watson, who was his armament expert, and 3 pilots from the Birmingham, Alabama Air National Guard and their wives. And they got on board the Empress of Russia, which was a Canadian ship, and it was important that it was a Canadian ship. And their first stop was in Japan, and then they went on to China. When they got to China in mid-36, Williamson and McDonald were the first 2 of the 3 men on the flying trapeze to get there. And toward the end of the year, the Generalissimo was captured by the communists in Siam in a coup attempt by the young marshal. And McDonald received a phone call from Madame Chiang Kai-shek and said, "Can you fly a tri-motor forward?" He said, "Yes, I can." And she said, "Well, will you participate in the rescue mission to get the Generalissimo back?" Which he did. And they successfully got the general back, and that cemented his relationship with Madame Chiang. Mid-year, this document was released in 2010. Mid-year in 37, he received a call from Madam Chiang Kai-shek, and he said, would you go on a spy mission into Japan? I'm going to give you a new name, a new passport, and your cover story is that you are the manager of an entertainment group of 43 entertainers, and she even gave him the 43 entertainers. And when he got past the Japanese immigration officials in Kobe, he jumped a train to Yokohama, climbed on board the USS Garfield, found Chennault. They slipped off the boat, got an open car, a convertible, and the article goes on to say that, like two young operatives, they had an unhealthy appetite for getting too close to airfields and harbor installations. And it took them 3 days, not a month, but 3 days, depends on what book you read. And when these authors didn't know what happened, they just made it up. But it was a 3-day trip, and they went back to Kobe, where McDonald had entered the country and got back on the Garfield, which had moved up the coast, and that was the next stop. Got on the boat and headed for China. When they got to China, on July 7th, the Japanese had attacked the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking, and the Second Sino-Japanese War in the north was underway. This is August 13th, 1937. This is the Izumo. It is an old, light Japanese cruiser. It is the headquarters for the Japanese Imperial Forces in China. And it began shelling the Shanghai Civic Center. Captain Chuck Sharp, chief pilot with China National Aviation Corporation, got up on top of the bank building over Shanghai Harbor to observe the action. And he looked down the river, and here come these 3 Chinese airplanes in suspiciously tight formation. And they came in and made dive bombing runs on the Izumo, and to their amazement and to Sharp's amazement, all 3 bombs just barely missed the ship. They flew off, regrouped, came back, strafed the Izumo several times, and then flew off. Sharp got down and later confronted McDonald, Chennault, and Williamson, and said, was it true that you were paid $1,000 apiece to attack the Izumo? And they would neither deny it or confirm it. When I was there in 2016, I spoke to the Kunming Aviation Association, and I had a retired 2-star general came up to me and confirmed that that story is completely accurate and widely known throughout China. This is a picture of Chennault, the Hawk 75, which was his personal plane, which was supplied to him under contract with the Chinese to get him to come. It was a P-38 prototype. And McDonald on the right, taking orders from General Chennault, they shared the airplane with 4 other individuals. And they were in Nanking, the capital of China, defending the city against the Japanese. And at the end of a long day, they would walk across Nanking Country Club, and they would occasionally stop and play 2 or 3 holes of golf as they walked up to the clubhouse where they were roommates. And at night, they would play team ping pong. And it was usually the colonel and McDonald against C.B. Smith and Harry Sutter, who was a Swiss radio specialist. And after a very vigorous ping pong game one night, Chennault came down and said, I've got a great idea. Let's get 100 American pilots and 100 American planes and give them the proper training, and we can kick the stuffings out of the Japanese. And that was the birth of the AVG, or the first time the AVG was ever mentioned. And that AVG eventually became the Flying Tigers. McDonald had other duties. As a single American advisor, he was invited to become a squadron commander since he was already an instructor, and all of these top Chinese pilots spoke English as well as Chinese, which was very fortunate. And he sent a squadron out, and they went with him, and he found the Rougeau, a Japanese carrier, and they attacked it. He also found the carrier Kaga, and one of his duties was to fly the Hawk out of danger every time there was an air raid. And there were air raids 66 days in a row, and sometimes more than one air raid in a day. During those air raids, he encountered 120 armed Japanese aircraft over Nanking. They had 91 Chinese combat aircraft, and the Japanese were attacking them with between 500 and 700 armed Japanese aircraft. So you had to have some guts to go up and take on those odds anyway. They both had bounties on their heads from the Japanese, so they must have been doing some sort of damage. And there were 2 squadrons of Japanese in Shanghai that were assigned to shoot down the Hawk 75. Now this is from the from the British Archives. British Naval Attaché Robert S. Aiken's intelligence report on March 7th, 1939. That night I had dinner with Colonel Chennault and an American instructor named McDonald. The latter is credited with having brought down a large number of Japanese, but he was reluctant to talk about his combat activities. The story, for what it's worth, is he was paid so much per hostile aircraft crashed. He was making so much that the Chinese reduced the payment to $1,000 in gold per plane he shot down, when the McDonald said that on those terms they could go and shoot the blanky things down themselves. Now let's move on to May 17th, 1940. His 4th one-year contract with the Chinese Air Force is up, and he is hired by China National Aviation Corporation, 55% owned by the Chinese government and 45% owned by Pan American. They tripled his pay and gave him, most importantly, they gave him the option to return to the United States and to immediately be made a captain with Pan American, and he could forego the 5 years of seniority that was normally required, and he could go at the time of his choosing. He referred to it as a job with a future. His first flight was out of Hong Kong. It was a British colony surrounded by the Japanese, and they only flew out at night, and they preferred to fly out at night and in bad weather so they wouldn't get shot down. And his first flight out, he flew to Chongqing in far western China, which had been moved there from Hankow, specifically to be out of the range of Japanese carrier aircraft. It was a very hard landing because you had to land on a 1,500-foot runway on a sandbar in the middle of the Yangtze River. And you had to clear a group of wires that came over the river at 3,000 feet and then make a dive for the runway. Here he's overrun the runway, and when he tried to turn around, he got his DC-2, he got his rear wheel stuck in the mud, and they're trying to get him out of the mud so that he can take off before the Japanese firebombing starts that day. Now, this is a picture of that runway where you can see the sandbar and you can see the 1,500-foot strip in the middle. And if you see that wire in the foreground, that's the wire that you had to clear, and then you had to make a dive for that runway. I'm not quite sure how they did that in foggy weather, but they did, and they did it at night too, which is sort of nuts. The man in the front picture is from Birmingham, is Ned Jones. He introduced Billy McDonald from Fairfield, poor side of Birmingham, to Peggy Spain from Mountain Brook, who was a Red Cross volunteer, which was the rich side of town, and they got married in Calcutta. This is the electrical flight. He was flying $10 million of gold bearer bonds from Hong Kong to Kunming, and they got a report of enemy fighter planes in the area, so they flew into an electrical thunderstorm to get away from them, knowing the Japs wouldn't come in after them. And the radio operator didn't roll the antenna in quite quickly enough, and they were struck 3 times by lightning, and it burned up all the electronics in the airplane, and the plane was definitely going down. The co-pilot panicked and had to be pulled out of the chair by the guard who was guarding the gold, and the radio operator, who then jumped in the seat to help McDonald try and land the aircraft. And when they broke through the bottom of the cloud, lo and behold, miracle of miracles, there is a road being built by 1,000 Chinese coolies. And when they landed on this road, which had not been surfaced yet, it picked up a lot of mud, so that when the plane came to a stop, there was so much weight on the wheels and the engine that it ended nose down. Well, the co-pilot just jumped out of the plane and started running. And Nettie yelled at him and said, "Hey, where are you going?" And never did get a reply. And it took him 3 weeks to get the gold moved to a local bank, to get the coolies to build him a runway to take off on, and get people brought in to repair the aircraft. When they did fly out and flew to Kunming, it was written up in Caillou's magazine and Los Angeles Examiner that the plane is here, the gold is here, the crew is here, short one co-pilot, last seen running northeast in Sichuan province, China. Now, oops, sorry. On December 7th and 8th, which is really the same day due to the international date line in Pearl Harbor and in Hong Kong, Hong Kong is attacked, and McDonald is the only CNAC plane. They didn't have many, they had 9. He was in Rangoon, Burma, when the attack took place. This is a picture of the CNAC hangar in Hong Kong, and behind it was the Pan American Clipper, which was the Japanese destroyed in the bombing, and then they blew up all the planes on the runway and in front of the hangar, but they didn't blow up the hangar. And fortunately, there were 4 planes that were left in the hangar. And he had a pivotal decision to make on this day. He had a choice. He could either fly with this passenger load of passengers, it was a DC-2, to Chongqing as called for, or he could fly to Taungoo, Burma, the British base where Chennault was training the Flying Tigers. Well, he wanted to know if the general had any orders, and he did. So he flew into Taungoo, landed in between 2 squadrons, 33 planes each, pilots with 66 rather angry Americans in their seats, guns loaded, engines running, ready to repel an attack from the Japanese. He pulled his plane over, did not stop the engine, dropped the door open, jumped out, ran across the field, and met Chennault running the other way. And Chennault, we don't have a transcript of what he said, but it seems clear from what they did that Chennault told him that the British had told him, you got about 30 days to get out of Taungoo before the Japanese overrun it. And if you don't go to Hong Kong and come back with 3 airplanes, we're dead. And he got back in the plane, flew to Chongqing, told the station manager in Chongqing what the situation was, and he told him, he said, well, you probably have the last CNAC plane left in existence because we cannot get Hong Kong on the radio. And under no circumstances are you to fly to Hong Kong. He thanked him for his suggestion and walked out the door and released his stewardess, canvassed his crew, refueled his plane, and landed in a blacked out Hong Kong at 1 o'clock in the morning. They flickered the landing lights for him to land, and he pulled his plane over in front of the other 4 planes that were getting ready for an evacuation and set it for 2 a.m. takeoff time. And at 1:30, the word came in from the Japanese that said anybody who takes off from this airstrip will be subject to having their head cut off if they are captured. At 2 o'clock, he flew to Chongqing without incident. And they got about 3 hours sleep and flew back to Hong Kong and participated in a 4-day evacuation of 275 people. He flew with Captain Chuck Sharp, the chief pilot, the last DC-2 out of Hong Kong, and it was rated to carry 22 passengers, and it had 74 people on board. His job as co-pilot was to trim the aircraft. That means get the fat guy to sit over here and get the 2 thin guys to sit on the opposite side on top of it and see if the plane will balance and actually fly. When they were going down the runway, they began to hear heavy Japanese shelling in the background, and what that meant is the Japs had arrived. And they nearly blew up the engines going down the runway trying to get the plane in the air. And went off the end of the runway. It did not go up, it went down. And it was headed toward the water when at the very last minute the ground effect kicked into play and the plane began to fly, and it clawed its way back in the air and went to Chongqing, where they released the 74 ecstatic passengers. And they picked up all of the remaining CNAC personnel and Mr. Bill Bond, Vice President with Pan American, who had already been in touch with the British in Calcutta and said that CNAC is on the way and is in search of a new home. When they got to Calcutta, they informed the British of their plans, and their plans were to follow survey routes that they had already flown. And they were going to fly from Calcutta over the 22,000 peaks of the Himalayas into Kunming with gasoline and gunpowder. Not your ideal cargo to fly over the hump with, but that's what they were flying in. And then they were going to fly from Denjan in India over the southern route, over the 18,000-foot peaks, and fly in gasoline and gunpowder for the purpose of keeping the Chinese in the war. They would pick up cargoes of tungsten and fly it back over the hump and then repeat the process. On December the 18th, they gave him 2 more airplanes, and his roommate, Captain Higgs and Captain Engel, flew to Tanggu and picked up Chennault at midnight and the ground crews. And I have a recording from a good friend of mine in Birmingham whose father was the head of the ground crews. And the 3rd Squadron volunteered to stay behind and help the British try and fend off the Japanese. And they had to stop in Lazio on the way back to Kunming and wait for Japanese fighter planes to clear the area. They arrived in Lazio and in Kunming at 6 o'clock in the morning, and at noon the P-40s flew in. The next day, 11 bombers flew over Kunming, Japanese bombers, and they did not know that the Flying Tigers were there. Part of the strategy of the Flying Tigers was to attack from a diving position, a very high rate of speed. The Flying Tigers came roaring out of the sky, and of course the Japs had never seen a P-40 with anything painted on it before. And they knocked down 4 planes in the initial pass, and only one of the remaining 7 made it back to the original base. But the Flying Tigers now had a base of operations inside China. Now, this is a turning point in the war. This is the Kunming Museum, and over my head, unfortunately I put my head in the wrong place for this picture, is the High Command for the Japanese, and they're overlooking the picture in the middle, which is the Salween River Bridge, and it connects Burma and China, and it is filled with Japanese special forces. And the Flying Tigers flew through the gorge and blew up the bridge. When they came back the next day, the Japs had built another bridge. It was a pontoon bridge, and they blew that bridge up. And when they came back the 3rd day, the Japs were gone. Everybody agrees that had they successfully crossed the bridge at that point, that would have freed up 1 million Japanese troops to fight the Allies in the Pacific. The Japanese had an additional plan, which was to try, if they were successful, was to try to conscript 5 million Chinese troops to join them in fighting the Allies in the Pacific. The Allies in the Pacific in May of 1942 had to face an additional 6 million troops. The outcome in the Pacific might have been just a bit different. This is a very famous flight. This is the Crocodile Flight, written up in 4 books. This man in the picture is Art Pendergast, and he was the senior CNAC mechanic. And his job was to get any downed CNAC airplanes back in the air if at all possible. An airframe was extremely valuable at that point in time. And this is Captain McDonald, who he has now risen to the rank of chief pilot with CNAC. It was a chief pilot's job also to find any downed aircraft and see if he could get them back in the air. Now, there are 2 pictures here. The one at the bottom shows the path from, in the lower right, from Kunming to Denjan, which is kind of in the center upper left. And Captain Carroll's flight did not arrive, and McDonald was sent for and told to fly to Denjan and to see if he could help find the airplane. And when he got there, he got in a room, and he got everybody who knew anything about this aircraft to get in the room and close the door and said, I'm going to ask questions, and I don't want anybody to say anything, just answer the questions as I ask them. And he interviewed the pilot who landed behind him, and he interviewed the pilot who landed in front of him, and got the conditions and found out there'd been a crosswind that had blown them, an unexpected crosswind that had blown them off course. And he found out about the cargo and who the pilot was and the gas and so forth and so forth. And finally he got a protractor out and drew a circle around Denjan, and he put his thumb on a spot on the circle, and he said, the plane is here. It is where 2 branches of the Manistee River comes together. And he said to Captain Attlee, will you fly down there in the morning and confirm that the plane is there and notify me in Calcutta, because I'm going to fly back tonight so the Japs won't shoot me down. And Attlee was a little suspicious, but and I have the letter in the book from Attlee, which is kind of fun to read, and he flew down there somewhat skeptical the next morning, and lo and behold, there's his plane sitting in the bottom of the river, gear down, and it was obvious that they had escaped on life rafts. And he sent word to McDonald, who sent word to Pendergast, and Pendergast got his crew of crackerjack Chinese mechanics together and got them on rubber rafts and headed them down the Manistee River. And unfortunately, they hit a rather large boulder in the middle of the river, and it threw one of the Chinese crewmen out, who unfortunately landed in the mouth of a 25-foot crocodile and was killed on the spot. And they had to fly on to, and they had to go on down the river to where the plane was located, and they got a local elephant to hook up to this airplane and drag it up onto a 700-foot runway. And they had to replace an engine, which took about 5 weeks, and they had to use the elephant to lift the engine up to get it to bolt it onto the airplane. In the meantime, they got pebbles out of the river and built a 700-foot runway on this sandbar, which you can see in the picture above is a Google Earth picture of today, and I drew in the where the runway was built. And finally, he sent word to McDonald. He says, the plane is in excellent shape. It's ready to go. It's at the end of the runway, and I built you a 700-foot runway. And I appreciate that it takes between 1,200 feet and 1,500 feet to take off a C-47. If you can find somebody crazy enough to take this plane off, please send them my way. And he sent word that I'll be there in 2 days. And so McDonald showed up, and they walked up and down the runway, and he developed his plan. And he said, all right, now I want you to get your crew to build a 10-degree ramp at the end of this runway as fast as possible, because there's weather coming fairly quickly and the wind's blowing in the right direction, and it won't be in another couple hours. So they put the ramp in, and as they walked down the runway, he explained the plan to Pendergast. He said, I want to put the plane in takeoff position at the end of the runway. We're only going to put 50 gallons of gas on it. We want it to be light as possible. And we're going to do an emergency burn on the engines, and if you don't hear anything that you don't like, give me the thumbs up at the end of a minute, and I'll let go of the brake, and we'll go down the runway, and we should hit this ramp at 60 miles an hour, and it should throw the plane up in the air, and we should reach 65 miles an hour, at which time the ground effect should kick into play, and it should start to fly. And Pendergast said, Mac, are you sure this is going to work? That sounds a little nervous to me. And he said, no, it's going to be fine. Let's go. So as they walked back down the runway, Pendergast had one more question. He said, what's the question? And he said, how many did you count? And McDonald said, 15. He said, well, that's the same number I got. And he was referring to the 15 crocodiles that were in a semicircle around the back of the aircraft. And they got on the plane, closed the door, and they went up front and started the 1-minute burn. And at the end of 30 seconds, they heard the back door of the plane open and a body was thrown in. And they looked, and there was a sick mechanic that McDonald had refused to fly out because he was trying to keep the plane as light as possible, and the mechanic was quite ill. And Pendergast ran back and got the mechanic and dragged him up to the front of the airplane. And McDonald, in the meantime, had taped the mic open so they could hear what was going on in the cockpit in Denjon. So when the minute was up and everything was all right, he got the high sign from Pendergast, and he let go of the brake on the plane. And the plane started bouncing pretty violently from side to side, and he was very worried that it had enough air pressure in the tower, but he said, well, we're going to keep going. So as they went down the runway, they hit the end of the ramp at 60 miles an hour. It threw the plane up in the air, and as it started down with the props 3 inches from the water, the ground effect kicked into play, and the plane started to fly. And his quote over the radio was that, I believe we've got her now. And they flew over the river, and they were confronted by a tree that had a big V in it. And he had to bank the plane nearly 90 degrees to get it through that V. And then the plane started to fly normally, and his response over the radio was, everything went just the way we planned it. And the word that came back over the radio was a Hindi word, which is called Burashab, which means great one. And that is the story of Captain Flight, the Crocodile Flight. Now, my sister was born in Shanghai on January 8th, 1947. Her godmother was Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and her godfather was General Chennault. On August 1st, 1947, Mac reluctantly leaves China as the communists are coming right around the corner, and it's not the safest place to raise a brand new baby girl. This is a picture of the McDonalds when they got back to the United States. They just went on from San Francisco and went to Miami. And when his foot hit the ground in Miami, he was immediately made a captain with Pan American. And within a matter of days, he was flying flights into South America, which he had flown these routes back in the 30s before he had gotten hooked up with Chennault. I was born in 1948 in Miami. He received a promotion to Rio in Brazil, which back then was a beautiful, clean South American city, not like it is today. And he flew to Buenos Aires and to Bremen. And unfortunately, my mother, my sister, and I, we all caught polio. And she was quite sick and had to go to New York. Ours was more like manifested itself sort of like a cold. And at the end of 30 days, they sent word that we're sending your wife back to Birmingham to be with her parents. You should send the children up to be with her to be good therapy, and you should give serious consideration to bringing your flying career to an end, which he did. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the only picture we have of him in a Pan American uniform. He's a short guy in the middle. And he returned to the United States in 1955. He had been gone for 19 years. He and Peggy McDonald received a phone call from then General Chennault. Chennault was going to die within the next 10 days, and General wanted them to come down and help make arrangements for the funeral at Arlington Cemetery, which they did. Daddy's in the group of men on the left, third from the end. He's the shortest guy in the group, as you can tell. And there were 1,000 people at the funeral, and the general was promoted to lieutenant general the day before he died. Daddy's primary duty was to get a notebook out, and the general said, I want you to make a list of the following people, and these are the people that I do not want invited to my funeral, which he did. In 1977, he started on his long-awaited book, and he did what you guys are talking about here. For his group, he got all his pilots to write in stories. That's the best story that they had, and he had a printing company at the time, and it was Wings Over Asia, and there was volumes 1, 2, and 3, and they carry on afterwards. So there's 7 volumes of those. So the memories that you have, please don't let those go, because if you don't document them and write them down, they're going to be lost. Right after he started working on his book, he had a stroke and was paralyzed and could not speak and use his right hand, so it looked like his books would not get written until after I had a heart attack in 2010, and I found, thanks to my wife Nancy, who I should have introduced when I first got up here, she's my chief of staff and done a fabulous job, found 30,000 documents that he had brought back in anticipation of writing this book, and unfortunately they were wet, so I had to dry them with a hairdryer, which was an interesting experience, and then I started reading them, and I really got in trouble at that point. He died in 1984, and this is a picture of the 106th Observation Squadron flying the missing man formation over the grave site. He and I were both in the same unit. This is a picture of, at the time, Colonel Newton presenting me with the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal that he had worked, and I'd worked for 4 years, and he had worked for 14 months to get. And it turned out that he had played taps at my father's funeral as a second lieutenant. And he is now General Newton in charge of the Army Guard and the Air Guard in Alabama, which is really quite unusual. The medals arrived 72 years late. And these are the certificates that go with the medals. And the book is to say thank you to Dad for all the stuff that he did. He was a remarkable guy. Excuse me, you'll have to. Excuse me, that's my blood pressure medication taken up for. But thank you for inviting me. And the books are in the back. The hardcover, we did a hardcover without color maps, and the pilots came and chewed us out and said we need for these maps to be in color because we want to see the relief when you fly from Kunming to Calcutta and to Denjon. We can tell on the color map and we can't tell on the black and white. So that book is $40. The taxes included in that, and then the softback book is 25. So it's a pleasure to be here, and if anybody has a question, I'd be glad to answer it. Thank y'all.
Are you a pilot?
Thank you. I'll answer that question, which was the funniest question that will be asked in this meeting today, is whether I was a pilot or not. If you flew with my father as a child, if you weren't scared of flying, you would be shortly thereafter. And I had to fly to China in 2016, and I was really rather claustrophobic too, and I was worried about flying in the dark over the North Pole. And then I found out that the twilight reflects off the ice, and there is no darkness, so there's this plane going over the North Pole, and there's one window that's up, and it's got my face in it looking, and aren't those snowdrifts absolutely wonderful? So no, I'm not a pilot, and I prefer Delta, and I prefer old pilots with gray hair. Thank y'all very much.